In this lesson, we'll begin our discussion of the female reproductive system. We'll take a quick look as far as an overview of the organs of the female reproductive system, and then we'll study the ovaries and the uterine tubes. Right? You may know the uterine tubes as the fallopian tubes. Sometimes they even call them the oviducts. So here's just a listing of the organs that we're going to take a look at. The ovaries, again, the uterine tubes, which are known as the fallopian tubes or the oviducts. We'll take a look at the uterus, the vagina, and the vaginal canal. We'll take a look at all the different organs that are the external structures. We typically call that the vulva or even the pudendum. And then we'll finish up the anatomy by taking a look at the mammary glands. This is just an overview. This is a sagittal picture you can see here through the female pelvis and some of the things that we could see. Here's the ovary. This is going to be the fallopian tube over here leading to the uterus. Again, the vaginal canal would be right over here. And then this would be the vulva or the external structures. So we're going to just kind of work our way down that way. So let's begin by looking at the ovaries. Just like the testes are the male gonads that produce the sperm, the ovaries are the female gonads that are going to produce the egg or the oocyte. There's two ovaries, one on each side. They're about the size and shape of almonds, and they're found on the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity. They're off to the sides of the uterus. And as I mentioned, they function in producing the gametes, right, the oocytes that develop into a mature ovum. And we also know from the endocrine system, they're very important in producing estrogens, progesterone, right? Progesterone is so important to pregnancy. And then inhibin when we need to shut down hormones coming down from the anterior pituitary. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lesson. All right, so the ovaries, again, are the female gonads. They're located in the pelvic cavity on the lateral walls, produce the gametes, and very important for hormones. So let's take a look at what keeps the ovaries in place so they don't fall down, so they stay suspended where they need to be in order for conception to take place. The first ligament we're going to take a look at is actually a uterine ligament. So I'll mention this again when we do the uterus, but it does hold the ovary in place. If you take a look up over here, this is the uterus in the midline, right? And then off to the right and the left. I apologize, left and right. This is a posterior view. The left and the right, this is the back view. We see this big broad ligament, hence the name, the broad ligament. And the ovaries are suspended in place by this part of the broad ligament right here and right here. And this is what we call the mesovarium. All right, so you can see the ovary is really held in place nicely by the broad ligament below and the mesovarium above. Okay, and that's what I have over here. This is a uterine ligament. It attaches to the ovaries by a double layered fold of the peritoneum. All right, so these are actually peritoneal membranes, and that mesovarium up top here very nicely holds the ovary in place up here, while the broad ligament is doing a nice job down over here. Now, the ovarian ligament is going to attach the ovary to the uterine wall. So this ligament here on the right ovary and this ligament here on the left ovary keep the ovary attached to the uterus. And then before I go back to the notes, what keeps the ovary up so that it doesn't fall down along the side of the uterus, there's a ligament coming down. You can see part of it right here, even better on this side. This is the suspensory ligament right there. That's the suspensory ligament, and that's kind of holding the ovaries up. And you can see the suspensory ligament runs with the ovarian artery and the ovarian vein. All right, so the ovarian ligaments attach the ovary to the uterine wall. And then what keeps the ovaries suspended is going to be the suspensory ligament, suspensory ligament. Now, the part of the ovary, let me jump up for a second. Here's a picture of an ovary that's been cut on a frontal section. The part of the ovary where structures enter the ovary is known as the hilum, right? We see hilum in the kidney, we see a hilum in the lung, we see a hilum in the spleen. That's where structures move into an organ. So this is what we're going to describe next is the ovarian hilum, right? This is the point of entry for blood vessels and nerves. It runs along the mesovarium. Okay, so just know for me, the hilum is where the structures enter the ovary. All right, so here's a good picture again. Broad ligament, mesovarium up here, ovarian ligament, suspensory ligament. Again, these ovaries need to stay in place so that when ovulation occurs, the oocyte will go into the uterine tube, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so a little bit about the histology of the ovary. The ovary does have a covering around it. It's just some simple or cuboidal epithelium that covers the surface of the ovary. We're going to call that the germinal epithelium. Just underneath the germinal epithelium, we have a white connective tissue known as the tunica albuginea. This is the same type of tissue that is around the testes. So you can see embryologically the testicle and the ovary have the same covering, this tunica albuginea. So it's a white capsule of dense irregular connective tissue. It's right underneath this germinal epithelium. Now, if we slice the ovary and look into it, and we can actually see this under the microscope, there's an outer cortical layer we're going to call the cortex. It's just deep to the tunica albuginea, and this is where we see the different ovarian follicles. They're in different stages of development. I'll talk about that in a different lesson, and it's just a part as the ovarian cycle takes place. There's different types of follicles. So we'll save that for another lecture. But this is where you would find them if you looked under the microscope. They're going to be out by the cortex, and then we have some condensed connective tissue around the follicles. Just deep to the cortex is the medulla, right? So it's just deep to the cortex. This doesn't contain any of the follicles. This has more of the things that keep the ovary alive, such as blood vessels, nerves, and lymph, that type of thing. So we'll look at this picture again. So this whole thing is the ovary, right? The tunica albuginea is the white covering on the outside. Then the cortex here, all this is the cortex. We can see the different follicles. This happens to be a mature follicle. You don't have to know that now. These are, primary follicles. There's just different stages of development, which we'll talk about later. The outer layer is going to be the germinal epithelium. All right, and then on the inside, this is the medulla. Okay, so cortex, medulla. Okay, so that's it for the ovary right now. Let's finish up this lesson by taking a look at the uterine tubes. As I mentioned, a lot of times people call them the fallopian tubes. You may hear the terms oviduct. Now, these are going to extend laterally from the uterus, and they're going to kind of cover the ovary. They're a hollow tube. They're muscular. We'll look at their histology in a minute, and they're roughly 5 inches long or so. And the main job is going to be to transport the oocyte to the uterus. Okay, and if there was conception, we would even call that the zygote. But we'll talk about that again later in another lesson. So when you look at the uterine tubes, you're going to see that there's 1, 2, 3 regions that we want to identify. So here again, just to kind of give you some bearings, you're going to take a look at the uterus. Here's the ovary, and then you can see extending from the uterus all the way over to the ovary. This is all going to be the uterine tube or the fallopian tube, right? We could see it on this side also. So we're going to see 3 regions. This first part that kind of looks funnel shaped, hence the name, infundibulum, is going to be the first part, and then we're going to see there's these little finger-like projections extending over the ovary known as the fimbriae. It's almost like they wave and pull the oocyte that's been ovulated into the fallopian tube. This area here is going to be the ampulla. Now this is actually the site where usually fertilization takes place, and then where the this narrow part over here where the fallopian tube or the ovarian tube attaches to the uterus, this is the isthmus. So those are the 3 regions I'd like you to know: infundibulum, the ampulla, and the isthmus. And then attached to the infundibulum is the fimbriae. So Again, this funnel part, again, that's why they named it this, is the expanded funnel area. It covers over the ovary, and then extending from that, guys, are the fimbriae. These are finger-like projections, and it's almost like they wave and they kind of pull the oocyte that's been ovulated into the fallopian tube. The ampulla is the middle segment. If you look at it histologically, the thickness and the muscle layers actually increase as the ampulla gets towards the uterus. If you just want to add in your notes, I don't think I put it in your lecture outline. The ampulla is usually the site of fertilization also. And then finally, the isthmus is going to attach the fallopian tube, like I said, to the uterus. All right, a little bit about the histology. So there's three layers. There's the mucosa, which is the inner layer. This is predominantly ciliated, simple columnar epithelium. And if you think about it, the cilia are important because they're kind of moving the oocyte towards the ovary. Remember, cilia kind of move things across the cell. Then deep to that is going to be the muscular layer. This is going to have two layers of smooth muscle. There's an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer, similar to what was seen when we looked at the digestive system. Like the organs always had an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer, and that would be smooth muscle. And then the outermost layer is the serosa. So you can see the uterine tubes have a kind of collapsed lumen. You'll see it's not a big round lumen, it's more collapsed. All of these cells here, kind of purplish, these are going to be the columnar epithelium that have the cilia on them. And then you can see this is just some connective tissue underneath. This would be like the lamina propria, and then out over here is going to be our smooth muscle. So the last couple of things about the uterine tubes. Let's talk about fertilization. So I had mentioned before, fertilization does occur in the uterine tubes. For fertilization to occur, the oocyte, is specifically known as a secondary oocyte, must meet the sperm within 12 to 24 hours of ovulation, right, within the uterine tube. Fertilization typically occurs near the boundary between the ampulla and the isthmus, right? So I typically think of the ampulla is the place. I want to mention just one other cell. There are cells in the fallopian tube or uterine tube epithelium. They're known as PEG cells. This is kind of interesting. They secrete some fluids that complete a process known as capacitation. This is kind of like a time where the sperm become active, right? This is where they're able to do fertilization. So this chemical or the secretion is important in making the sperm more viable to do fertilization. The fluid also provides some nutrients to the sperm, which is good, and then also the pre-embryo, right before the embryo would be what is the result of fertilization. Okay, this is just a picture of the fallopian tube. You can see they had to magnify this 4,000 times. So this is an electron microscope where you can see the cilia and the mucosa. And again, this would be the cilia that's going to move the egg along. And then these are some of the mucus cells that are producing different secretions. The PEG cells are going to be in there also. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on the ovaries and the fallopian tubes.